Every year, billions of dollars vanish. Lives are ruined, families shattered, and it all starts with one text.
Hey, are you picking me up at the airport?
Welcome to Stolen, hosted by former prosecutor Erin West, a relentless voice exposing the brutal truth behind transnational organized crime and one of the most dangerous and underreported crimes in the world, pig butchering scams. These are not random frauds. They're global, organized, and devastating. Victims aren't just losing money, they're losing hope. This is the podcast where the silence breaks. Stolen. And now your host, Erin West.
Hi, friends, and welcome to the Stolen Podcast. My name is Erin West. I'm a former prosecutor who retired to fight scams all day, every day with my nonprofit, OperationShamrock.org. It's been an amazing couple of weeks in transnational organized crime, and we've seen some great sunbeams that have given us hope for what can be done in this space. We've seen Cambodian tycoons indicted. We've seen $15 billion in the hands of the United States government and subject to a forfeiture order. We've seen people wheeling their suitcases out of KK Park, and we've seen even some bombs going off in KK Park. We've also heard about Starlink turning off 2,600 receivers from getting access to the satellite communications. And those are amazing steps forward. Amazing. But we have to be really careful when we start talking about this on social media to not overstate what's happening. The fact is, the enemy is massive. The enemy got tipped off about a lot of this and moved human trafficked workers to other compounds. The bombs that have destroyed a couple of buildings in KK Park are literally just that, a couple of buildings in a park made up of hundreds of buildings. So the last thing I want to be is a wet blanket when I see amazing progress being made, but I also don't want to undo the work that we've been doing over the past 3 years to really sound the alarm of the massive threat that's happening in Southeast Asia. So let's celebrate these victories for sure, but let's also realize that this is a minor dent at best in the scamdemic and what is continuing to happen globally. Before we get to our first guest, I want to tell you how grateful I am for the sponsorship of two amazing companies, Scamnetic and BioCatch. BioCatch just released a global scams report, and it shows exactly what we thought it was going to show. Scams are on the rise everywhere. So I'm grateful for BioCatch putting some data behind what we are feeling on the ground. I'm also grateful that BioCatch gave me the opportunity to write for that report, and I was able to submit some information about my experiences on the ground in Cambodia. I'm grateful to both of these companies for sponsoring the Stolen Podcast and giving us the opportunity to get this information out there and really sound the alarm about the threat that we face. In the spirit of really breaking down what is happening in transnational organized crime, I asked my friend Ari Redbord to be on the podcast today. There's really no one better at breaking down the complex pieces of information that we've received recently. We've heard about indictments, we've heard about forfeiture actions, we've heard about sanctions, and now a FinCEN Rule 311 action. And so I'm delighted to have Ari Redbord with me today. He is the global head of policy and government affairs for TRM Labs, and a pleasure to break down these big steps with. So please join me in welcoming Erin. When I heard the amazing news, and as a matter of fact, I got it pre-dawn on the day it was going to happen with an embargoed piece of information telling me that a huge sum of money belonging to a Cambodian tycoon was in the hands of the U.S. government, and that additionally, there was an indictment against him. I could not have been happier. I have been talking my face off for years about this massive problem we have with transnational organized crime in Cambodia and how they're stealing a generation's worth of money And so when I want to unpack this in a way that it will make sense to my Aunt Terry and other listeners of Stolen, I thought, you know who is an expert at explaining things on a level we can all understand? It's Ari Redbord. So thank you for volunteering to come talk about this.
Erin, such a pleasure, and thank you so much. It's funny, when I saw the action that morning a couple weeks ago, my first thought was went to you, and I'm so glad that you had a heads up here because, it's interesting. I've loved watching your career because I think in part it started with it started and finished with victims, and it still does today. But I saw you go from working with individual victims to, I think, more broadly understanding that these are transnational organized crime networks, and you don't take those down by tracing out victim funds one local law enforcement case at a time, quite frankly. And I've watched your career and your messaging and your expertise develop into this whole of government approach, whole of multinational approach, where you have to use criminal enforcement, indictments, criminal charges, where you have to use national security tools like sanctions, diplomacy, where we should be going after using trade against China, using the whole of government. And when I saw this action, forfeiture actions, and we'll talk about that today, when I saw this action, I immediately thought, wow, this is what Erin has been talking about for so long. And I think we finally have at least the best example of that now today with this Prince Group case.
I couldn't be more thrilled. I've always operated from the jump in this space with a what if we could attitude, that this is unprecedented. The level of threat is unprecedented, that this is our 9/11 in finance, and we need to respond accordingly. I'm so glad that another thing I like to talk about is let's use every tool in our arsenal. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, because you've got some expertise in the various toolboxes that people have. You've been in this space in a number of different ways. So what my understanding is, and then I want to take them one at a time, is I understand that the DOJ has issued an indictment for Chen Zhi. Chen Zhi is the leader of the Prince Group, and he's been indicted for his crimes associated with money laundering and with theft and whatnot. We'll get to that. Is that the United States government has come into possession of $15 billion attributed to this bad actor, and there will be a forfeiture action related to that money. And then finally, that the United States joined with the United Kingdom in issuing sanctions against property associated with the Prince Group and Chen Zhi. Do I have those three things correct?
You nailed it. Believe it or not, there's one other piece to this.
Give it to me. What else you got?
I'll give you another one. FinCEN, on this same day, the Financial Intelligence Unit for the U.S. Treasury Department, announced a 311 action, which is basically under the U.S. Patriot Act. It allows us to designate certain entities as primary money laundering concerns. And essentially what that does is cut them off from the global financial system, similarly to the way sanctions does. The difference between 311 and OFAC sanctions, and we'll kind of get into this in a moment, is 311 action, there's a whole bunch of different remediation sort of things that can occur. One is this final cutting off from the financial system, which they did here against We1, which is a group of financial institutions essentially that have been used at scale by these networks that we're going to be talking about to launder funds. So not exactly Prince Group, but going after the financial intermediaries that are also involved in laundering some of the funds here, but announced the same day in the same press release from the U.S. Treasury Department.
Thank you so much. That is a piece that I definitely need some additional knowledge on. So I am grateful for that. All right, so let's take them one at a time. You were a U.S. attorney. You told us that was one of the highlights of your career, to be able to say Ari Redbord for the people of the United States of America. I know that feeling in terms of Erin West for the people of the state of California. It's a tremendous honor to be able to say those words, and it's a tremendous responsibility. So thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Erin. I've loved bonding with you over that shared experience over the years.
So talk to me about this indictment. Tell me what you know about the indictment and the relevance of it. Let me just phrase it in this way. If you want to disrupt transnational organized crime and you have all of these tools in your arsenal, clearly one of the top tools for the Department of Justice is being able to indict bad actors.
Yep.
So tell me about that.
Absolutely. And I can kind of go through this and then maybe talk why you do criminal charges sort of more broadly.
Yes.
First, yes, the U.S. Department of Justice out of Brooklyn, which is the Eastern District of New York, unsealed an indictment again a couple weeks ago when this case dropped against Chen Zhi, who was the orchestrator of this both human trafficking scam compound, this essentially organized criminal network. And there's a bunch of reasons why you indict a case. And I really would encourage anyone who's listening to read the indictment, this one in particular. And a good indictment really tells the story of a case. And this one really goes deep into all of the different offenses that line up to the charges ultimately in the case, to include public corruption, collaborating with different public sector entities in Cambodia and China and elsewhere. And also, talks about the scheme, how the human trafficking worked, how the scams work. So encourage really reading it. But essentially what the charges here are money laundering, conspiracy. In other words, that he conspired with others to launder the illicit proceeds, and in this case, proceeds from human trafficking and these scam compounds, and fraud. And wire fraud conspiracy. And wire fraud is basically essentially using the mail. These days, the mail is anything that has an internet connection to commit fraud. And clearly, this entire network of scams to the tune of billions of dollars was the fraud that's at issue here. So what an indictment does is indictments are the official criminal charges against an individual. And the only way to get an indictment into the United States is you go in, and I did this, every day over the course of 11 years, to a grand jury. And it is a group of people who have agreed to sit for sometimes a long period of time, up to 18 months or so in certain jurisdictions, and listen to prosecutors essentially tell these stories about what happened in their case, put on witnesses, read in testimony. And after however long it took, a grand jury was able to ultimately sign off on the charges that the prosecutors in Brooklyn recommended, and they are pretty significant. Before you stop me, I'll just say one more thing is that the goal of an indictment is ultimately to make an arrest, right? You want to take those charges and you've got to want to go arrest someone. But the reality is that when we're talking about these types of cases, transnational cases that involve places like Cambodia and China, places that involve jurisdictions like Russia, Iran, North Korea, we're not able to get our hands on those individuals. Those are not countries that are cooperating with us. They're not going to send someone over. They're not going to extradite them, even if we make that request. So the reality is, in a lot of cases these days, especially these huge ones, we're not able to arrest anyone, and we will likely not arrest anyone in this case. But an indictment does a whole bunch of other things, to include to name and shame someone, right? To make it very difficult for them to ever travel, right? Because if this individual travels to Europe, to places across APAC, to the UK, to Australia, to so many places all over the world, to places in the Middle East, where we do have extradition treaties with, that person will be arrested and ultimately sent to the United States. So you talk about sort of why you indict someone, you can really make someone's life very, very difficult, even short of arresting them. One thing really quickly, and huge shout out here to the UK also, who had a huge hand, a huge role in this case. They specifically put on travel restrictions on a number of different individuals, to include Chen Zhi in this case. So I'll stop there, but that's the indictment. That's the criminal charges. But what's so extraordinary about this case, and honestly, I would say this was an extraordinary indictment, but it's when you marry it up with those 3 or 4 other elements that you talked about at the start of the show, that's when it becomes really sort of like game changing.
Absolutely. That's when you are, I think so frequently we hear, well, we can't educate our way out of this. We can't arrest our way out of this. And my opinion about that has been, yes, but we need to do all of them all the time, all at once, and make it as difficult as we can for these bad actors to do their business.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I think this is another reason why you and I have gotten along so well over the years. And there's like, people talk about like, oh, we just can't do whack-a-mole. And I'm always like, of course you could do whack-a-mole. You just got to whack those moles. Like, we have to add friction. We need to make their life more difficult. And eventually, if you whack enough moles, you'll get to cause enough friction where maybe bad actors will think twice before doing it. It's not an ideal system. You'd rather like take that mole out completely. But the reality is that like, these are the types of things that are whacking moles, that are adding friction, that are making more difficult for these organizations to operate.
That's exactly right. I talk all the time about, is turning off Starlink going to end this? Well, no, but turning off Starlink and stopping the cement company from crossing that river from Thailand into Myanmar to build KK Park. Like anything that we can do at any time to make it more expensive, more difficult, more time consuming for the enemy to do their work is what we should be doing all day, every day when we are in this type of crisis. It's been able to really plant itself dig deep for 5 years without really a ton of friction. So to me, this is a turning point because it shows what can be done. I want to walk you through for a second the criminal element of this. So if you are filing a state complaint, you can file that state complaint based on documents and based on an affidavit from a detective. But in this case, what we're looking at is a criminal indictment that has been heard by a grand jury. So can you tell me a little bit more about the standard for that? And can you also tell me a little bit more about the fact that there's no defense attorney at a grand jury? So how do we assure the public that we're doing this on the up and up and that things are fair to the accused?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And, it goes to standard of proof, oftentimes. And I often have these conversations with people. When you step in a courtroom and you have a defendant there, the burden on the government is beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not beyond any doubt, to be very clear, but it's beyond a reasonable doubt. If it's 60%, that's not enough, right? If it's 70%, there's always questions about what reasonable doubt means. But it's a very, very high standard, the highest standard that we have in the legal system. When you go into a grand jury and you ask them to vote on an indictment, the standard is probable cause. And that means essentially, did this probably happen? Is there strong evidence that this activity occurred? So it is a lower burden because at the end of the day, that defendant is going to ultimately go to trial and have the higher burden, or the government is going to have the higher burden to bear. But it's still a pretty significant standard. And no, you're absolutely right. There is no defense attorney in grand jury. In fact, grand jury proceedings are completely confidential, meaning no one can leak what happens inside a grand jury or who the grand jurors are. There's a federal rule that basically says you have to have a list of people who are going to have any knowledge of these grand jury proceedings, which are usually the prosecutor, and you add agents and types of folks that way. Well, look, I think our system is built on belt and suspenders in so many different ways, right? You mentioned a criminal complaint, which is often the first thing that is filed here. You make an arrest, you do a search, right? There's standards there's burdens of proof for each of those different things. And ultimately, the idea is eventually that defendant will have a lawyer and will ultimately be defended in court, but the prosecutor should be able to bring charges, without the defendant necessarily knowing about that. In this case, it was really important. Remember, prosecutors indicted this case and then went to a judge and asked them to seal it, meaning have it be non-public until the government was ready to unseal it, and for people to ultimately know that there was essentially an arrest warrant out there pending in the world.
So thank you for that description. That's helpful. One of the things that people often said when talking about what do we do with these bad actors on the other side of the world, does it even make any sense to get a warrant for their arrest? And I was always so in favor of getting these warrants because of the travel restrictions. So can you tell me a little bit about what our agreements are with other countries and what this really means for someone like Chen Zhi?
Yeah, absolutely. We have treaties with countries all over the world. We call them mutual legal assistance treaties, or MLAs. And we have them with most countries. There are a handful, many countries we don't have them with. Some of the ones I mentioned, but some of the ones that are allies where we just don't really have that type of extradition treaty. So yeah, and then you can also, under these treaties, make requests for information. So the Department of Justice has an entire office, the Office of International Affairs. Their entire job is to liaise with other law enforcement entities, other prosecutors all over the world, to ask for information, file a mutual legal assistance request. And often Interpol, which is the International Police Organization, will get involved. They have what they call a red notice, where if you're a certain jurisdiction, you can file for a red notice. And that means it's almost an international, essentially, arrest warrant or an alert that goes out across these different countries. But there's all kinds of interesting interplay there, right? Like sometimes you want a defendant to know for all kinds of reasons, right? And there's sometimes a chance you don't. And, an extradition itself is hard. You basically have to show in most jurisdictions in most other countries that they have a law that is commensurate with the law that is being charged in the United States. I'll give you an example. When I was a prosecutor, I was prosecuting a case involving Iranian sanctions violation, Iranian export control. And we asked the German authorities to arrest an individual who was at the center of IRGC, which is Iran's Iranian Guard, their highest level military, who is a major funder of Hamas and other terrorist organizations. We asked that they arrest a financier because he was violating export control. After months of back and forth with the German authorities and the court and others, the German court released this individual, saying that Germany doesn't have the sanctions regime in place that the U.S. had in these types of cases. That is there's so many examples of this. But I say that, like, you'll have to, when you arrest someone somewhere, you'd have to show that those charges exist that place. That would not be a problem here if we were to get him to a jurisdiction that we could, money laundering, conspiracy, fraud, human trafficking. Yeah, these are pretty much international crimes. And I imagine he would be extradited, but he will likely never leave the places that he is currently in to face extradition.
So he's essentially been penned in to certain countries that won't extradite him to the United States.
Yeah, and not an ideal result, but also not a terrible result, to keep someone where they are, to stop them from traveling. We always used to joke, and this is like, prosecutor joking is maybe a little bit weirder than other people joking. But, there are two places in the U.S. bad actors would take risks to travel. Orlando, to take their family to Disney World, and Las Vegas to go with their buddies. I can't tell you how many times we were able to grab someone in one of two of those places when they traveled. So I will say that, like, it's not only the United States, but people want to go to Disney in Paris and all these different places all over the world. Like, people want to go see Italy.
Your kid's going to college somewhere,
right?
We
exactly, that's right. You want to go visit your kid in college. We need to make sure that we're in those places when these bad actors do take the risk to travel, and we'll ultimately see if this is one of those people.
Yeah. Here's what I also wanted to say about this indictment that I found noteworthy, and I wonder if you did as well. The amount of evidence that the government has that this person was personally involved in some of the dirtiest parts of the pig butchering, human trafficking organization. Were you surprised by that?
I thought it was I thought the indictment was extraordinary for a number of reasons, like just the detail and the clear internal communications that the government ultimately had, and that's a great example of, he knows the ins and outs of this business. He's involved in every aspect. Yeah, I thought that was extraordinary. Some of the stuff around corruption I thought was really interesting. But you see, it's clear, like, it's all built on internal communications, which just goes to show that, digital evidence these days is just absolutely critical in every case. And here it's very clear that there was email and text messaging and that type of correspondence. But yeah, no, it's a great point, Erin.
Yeah, it's a prime example of great investigation and what digital evidence can unlock and can show, and can really show the level of culpability, not just of Chen Zhi in the business, but his ties to government officials, and to show the level of corruption that's inherent in this dirty business that's happening in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and it's something that you've been talking about for a long time. We've been talking about it. We put out a piece on what we call shadow banking, which is basically China's underground money laundering networks to include organized crime. And it's really, I think, the first time that the U.S. government came out with something this detailed about the ins and outs of these types of organizations and how they are working with government officials oftentimes in these areas. This is not them being really good at hiding from government officials. It's clear that the government is colluding with these individuals in many of these instances. And it's extraordinary for the U.S. government to kind of come out with this level of detail.
Yeah, it's a super impressive document. But while we're talking about the Chinese money laundering operations, and quite frankly, it's an amazing, super functional, highly organized way of moving dirty money around the world. And I think that the forfeiture action against $15 billion is so significant, just in showing that that was a small piece of this total operation. What is your take on just the amount of money that has come into the hands of the government?
It's staggering. It's absolutely staggering. And it's funny, like, I think you and I think the same way on this too. Like, the first thing I saw was like, wow, that is a lot of money. And that is only one piece of one organization. And that's when we start talking about just the level of fraud and financial impact here that this is having globally. So that was my first take, was like, hey, this is a huge amount of money. And I think we really need to focus on this. This is a historic forfeiture action. But it's also like, man, I think I've told you before, we put the number at about 53 billion since 2023 on scams and fraud in the crypto ecosystem. And that's a huge number. I mean, it's unbelievably huge number, but that number could be 85% higher because we're seeing essentially only about 15% of victims report. So it's not surprising, right, necessarily that we're getting to these types of numbers with a 15 billion forfeiture like that. But I think that if we're trying to put numbers on this, which I know is really compelling, and I know you do a great job of, frankly, we work closely together on that. Yeah, it's a huge number, but also 15 billion is an amazing win. It's an amazing win for the government to take that much money out of circulation for these bad actors.
It's an amazing amount of money, and it's a big hit. When I think about the number that you just gave me from TRM puts it at 53 billion in crypto in a 2-year time period.
That's correct.
Okay.
Since 2023. So
since 2023.
We're close,
okay.
2 to 3 years. Yeah.
Okay. And so what I take is I take the IC3 numbers and I add them. I add up 6.5 billion in 2024 to investment scams plus 673 million in romance scams. I get over 7 billion. I use 1 in 7 reports. And I know this is like back of a napkin type stuff. And
it's the only way to do it though. Because I mean, there's so many, it's very hard to put your finger on these numbers. Yeah.
Right. There's not enough data. So at least when I'm giving a number, I'm telling what it's based on. You're telling what it's based on. I think there are some numbers that are astronomical that you can't really back up where we get the number. But my number has been that I've been saying this past year is 50 billion United States alone last year alone. And when you look at your number of 53 billion, what it's showing me is I'm still missing money because if you're at 53 billion and we think maybe 1 in 7 is a good number, that we put that, and now we're at 250 billion, you think, but you have what's identifiable on the blockchain. The fact is, it's a lot bigger. It's a lot bigger than we thought. It's a massive money flow.
Massive money flow. Yeah, absolutely. There's no question. You and I are both trying to do similar math. I'm taking that 53, I'm multiplying it by, essentially increasing by 85%.
Right.
So you're getting, it's a massive number, and it shows the seriousness of this issue and why it is a national security issue, global security issue, as opposed to a criminal issue alone.
Yeah. So talk to me about that, because when I see these numbers, to me, these numbers are staggering because they're not coming from corporations. They are coming from my cousin and the family that plays baseball with your kid and somebody else's mother-in-law. Like it's household by household. These are huge numbers when you think of what it takes to accumulate that much wealth.
Absolutely. And, you see it every day. I mean, every one of us is targeted all day long. I mean, multiple times a day, I'm getting some type of text message that we all know is leading to some broader conversation on investment fraud, scams, pig butchering, romance scams. Yeah, there's no question. It is an absolute epidemic. And this is why we're starting to see these really interesting parallels between the way we've attacked the war on drugs, for better or worse, over the years, the way we've attacked the war on terror, for better or worse, over the years. I think we're now starting to see this put in this category where we're willing to pull certain levers that we have not, that I think in the time that you and I have been thinking about this issue, that we've not really seen. Right? We've seen this as a law enforcement issue. We work with amazing FBI agents, IRSCI, Secret Service, who are tracking and tracing lost or stolen funds. Now we're seeing this whole of government approach that the Prince case really, I think, shows what is possible out there if you do use this interagency and multinational approach.
Yeah, you got to put data sets together to figure this out. So to me, the goal has always been to elevate the importance of this and to educate that this is a national security issue. Tell me why you think it's a national security issue.
I think, look, I think that you've said this best over the years, and quite frankly, I've quoted you all over about this transfer of wealth, right? I mean, this is organized criminal groups going after the wealthier parts of the world, right? It's the U.S., it's countries like Singapore and Japan and Korea, it's countries in Europe, it's the U.K., and they are going after individuals and they are stealing money and taking advantage of, people who aren't as maybe understanding the technology or or looking for companionship, like whatever the scam is, it's just a scam. And this is fraud. And we're seeing it at scale. And I think that's really where we see this national security, the need for a real national security response. And these are not individual criminals, right? These are not, street criminals. These are not street thugs. These are organized criminal networks. And we need to approach it that way, right? This is not going after the corner drug dealer. This is going after the cartel. This is not going after the bomber. This is going after the terrorist financing network. And I think that's how we're elevating it, by going after the networks as opposed to just the individual cases.
Yeah, no, I'm wondering about this staggering amount of money, and I'm hoping you can help me walk through what a forfeiture procedure looks like, because quite frankly, I have a lot of victims who would like to know what's going to happen with that money. And I know that things don't move as quickly as people would like in the criminal justice system or in the civil forfeiture system. Can you walk me through what some reasonable expectations for victims should look like?
Absolutely. So a civil forfeiture action, which is what we have here, is, I think, one of the most powerful tools that we have in law enforcement. Because remember, I think one thing that people don't always understand, and I've seen some discrepancies around this too, this civil forfeiture action is not against any individual or entity. It's against the money that was seized. And I can't tell you exactly when the money is seized. On chain, it appears that it may have been seized around 2024 when these funds last moved. There's some conversation in the charging documents about maybe an insider who stole some of this money, and the U.S. government was able to get its hands on it. But regardless, today the U.S. government says that they have this $15 billion in Bitcoin, and they are asking a judge to forfeit it. I've written a ton about this because I get asked all the time about, people interchangeably use seizure. Seizure is when you are taking the funds, right? The government believes that they have their ill-gotten gains, and they want to ultimately take them. They go ahead and do that. And that's basically the equivalent of compounding a car, right? Like, hey, you take possession of that property because you believe that it's connected to a crime, and you have to show probable cause in order to do that. It's that same standard as getting an indictment in the first place. Now, forfeiting that car is when you take it. It's not just that the defendant can't get a hold of it. It's that the government now owns it. And that's what we see in this process right now with the funds. The government has filed a civil forfeiture complaint, the largest in U.S. history, against $15 billion that the government says is essentially ill-gotten gains from this scam, human trafficking, criminal network. And the government is making its case to a judge. The government standard, this is fun. We're getting to talk a lot about fun legal stuff that I know we both spent time on as prosecutors, by a preponderance of the evidence. And that is a higher standard. That means more likely than not, that you can show that it is more likely than not, so higher than probable cause, it's more than probably, it's lower than beyond a reasonable doubt, but preponderance of the evidence is 51%. It's 50% and a feather. It's got to be more likely than not that these funds were used in this way. And the government makes a very, very compelling argument in its complaint. So the government is filing an action saying, hey, we're not going to just compound this car, we're going to take this car. And that car happens to be $15 billion in this instance. But it's a really powerful tool when you can't get your hands on somebody, or hey, sometimes taking people's money is more upsetting to them than taking their liberty. I mean, it happens all the time. You arrest a drug dealer, I can do 18 months standing on my head. But when you take their house and their Escalade and all of this, people get sort of more upset. Now, if you can take $15 billion, that would have been generational wealth for this person's family and their brother's family and their sister's family and all these people, hey, maybe that's a pretty good dent. And you're bringing it back, hopefully, to victims. I know there's so many people who care deeply for victims in these cases and victims who listen to this podcast. It's going to be a long legal process here. But ultimately, I think there's a really good chance that some of these funds will go back to victims as long as those victims can tie that compensation directly to cases that they were involved in or instances they were involved in. And when you're talking about this much money, to be honest with you, and I don't have any inside scoop on this, I don't know how this is going to play out, right? We've seen compensation funds developed for this much money. When you're talking about 9/11, when you're talking about asbestos cases, vaccine cases, there's all kinds of examples through history of this. It'll be interesting to see how the Department of Justice ultimately takes these funds and tries to provide some restitution to victims here, but that is going to be a process, and it's going to take some time to play out. Remember, the government has now seized these funds, but they don't own them yet. So we're going to see that play itself out through court. And I'll be following it very closely. I'm sure you will too. But then ultimately trying to figure out how to get funds back to victims. I will say, and I know it's hard, and I know victims listen, that most government agencies are very focused on trying to get restitution back to victims. It's always the number one priority. I think the challenge often becomes like, having the systems in place to do it, ensuring that you have the right people who are getting the right funds back. And sometimes they've put administrators in place, but I think there are probably examples out there, but $15 billion is a huge amount of money. And I wonder to what extent we're going to need real help from Department of Justice, from the U.S. Treasury Department, from others who are involved here.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch. So if I'm understanding correctly, and I know about how we were able to, at the REACT Task Force, get seized money back into the hands of victims, and it's not easy. It's a wrangle. It's a difficult process. But when I'm thinking of this, it appears to me then that a U.S. attorney is going to have to prove to a court, to a preponderance of the evidence standard, that the money that they are in possession of is the result of ill-gotten gains, that it is, in fact, illicit funds. And,
exactly.
Okay. And so then, if I understand correctly, then there will need to be some decision made about what to do with that $15 billion. And as you and I sit here today, it's not clear what will happen to that $15 billion. Is that fair to say?
I think that's true. Yes.
Okay. And when I think about this pragmatically, I think about it in terms of what it would take to actually identify the individual people that would be entitled to that. It would really, to me, require almost a career level of deconstructing the entire Prince Group financial empire to try and tie that to individual people, which seems quite difficult, pragmatically.
Huge challenge.
If not impossible. And so from where I sit, what makes the most sense for at least part of that money would be to establish some sort of fund for victims. And so, quite frankly, that's on my agenda. That is exactly what I think should be happening with the majority of this money, but certainly I understand that there will be other competing interests for that money.
Yeah, look, I think that, I spend a fair amount of time on Capitol Hill, and I think there's a lot of people talking about those types of things when you're talking about seized digital assets in particular. I mean, if you read, first of all, I want to be like, people talk all the time about a strategic Bitcoin reserve or a strategic crypto reserve. That does not exist today. It was part of an executive order that the White House put out. We've seen bills introduced on Capitol Hill, but that doesn't exist. So maybe someday we'll have a strategic Bitcoin reserve, strategic crypto reserve. But right now, what we're really doing is when we think about asset forfeiture in the crypto ecosystem, we're thinking about victim restitution, and we're thinking about, going into initiatives that the U.S. Marshals are involved in and others. But the same thing that would happen if you seized bulk cash or an oil tanker or any of that. But there are parallels, and I mentioned them earlier. We've created asbestos funds over the years. We've created for victims of asbestos, for vaccines, right? For kids who are victims of encephalopathy and other types of things. You don't want to sue vaccine companies in tort. So the DOJ actually operates a fund that pays out victims that is collected from vaccine companies. The cool thing about this is that you have the funds right there, and you don't necessarily need to go raise those funds from industry or anyone else. So look, I think folks are talking about exactly what you're talking about here, and I think it would be really interesting as one pillar. Education, national security tools, and then victim compensation could be really, really interesting.
Yeah, we will wait and see because the amazing part of all of this is there's a huge chunk of money that could be allocated toward any of those, toward national security, toward education, all the things that we've been saying we need. There's a chunk of money available that might be at some point in the future allocated in those ways. And that's an exciting. Yeah. It is. It really genuinely is. For someone who complains a lot, that's a really great piece of information. That is a huge ray of sunshine coming through my window. Talk to me about sanctions and the usefulness of sanctions. So what we know is that the United States and the UK have designated a number of things, including a massive office building in London, a mansion in London, different flats in London. Tell me, what is the next step? What actually happens with those assets?
Yeah, no, I spent about 2 years at the office that oversees OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is the sanctions regulator in the United States when I was at Treasury. And these are extraordinary tools, and they're incredibly powerful. And for better or worse, sanctions have become the go-to national security tool for the U.S. government in the last 3 or 4 administrations. This is not a political issue. I was in the first Trump administration as a career civil servant. Tools were being used maybe against different actors, but in very much the same way as they were being used in the Obama administration and even previously. If we don't want kinetic war, we have to use economic tools. And we're using them really at scale. There's this question that you kind of raised in your question, Erin, about the efficacy of sanctions. And the question is like, how effective are they ultimately? Let me just like really quickly for your audience, explain sanctions, because I think they just hear this all the time. We sanction this guy, we sanction that guy. Essentially, they're legal and economic restrictions that the U.S. government, in case of U.S. governments across the board, use it, the UK, the EU, to change behavior or punish different violations of international norms. So think going after terrorist financiers, going after North Korea, going after fentanyl networks, going after these types of scam networks and criminal organizations. They can target individuals, they can target entities, they can target entire sectors or even whole countries. You see sanctions, comprehensive sanctions on entire countries like North Korea. So what ultimately does that mean? It means your assets are frozen. So any funds or property or accounts under U.S. jurisdiction or controlled by U.S. persons have to be blocked. So your funds are frozen. No one in the U.S. can do business with you. So that means U.S. citizens, that means companies, banks, exchanges. They cannot provide you with goods, services, or financial access. You're cut off from the global financial system in many cases. And this is really the power of these tools, right? The U.S. dollar is still the global reserve currency. And almost everyone is doing business in U.S. dollars. They may be through correspondent U.S. banking accounts, but basically because the U.S. dollar are central, you're essentially cut off. And then your name is publicly listed, right? There's a kind of name and shame aspect. There's one other really interesting part of sanctions, and that is there's something called secondary sanctions, which you hear, but no one really ever explains. And that this is really expanding U.S. jurisdiction beyond our border. They target non-U.S. persons or companies that continue to do business with sanctioned entities, right? So it's not just even prohibiting U.S. persons, but it's prohibiting anyone sort of globally really from interacting with, because you're threatening them also with sanctions. So I say all of that to say, when you read a couple weeks ago that, 146 individuals and entities that were associated with the Prince Group, plus you mentioned real estate, all of those individuals are completely cut off from the U.S. financial system. And anyone who is dealing with them is now threatened with secondary sanctions, right? Them being cut off from the global financial system. And it's real cool. Like the inside baseball is, look, like there's an entire targeting team at OFAC that is looking around the world and saying, hey, where should we be targeting our authorities? And then you have a policy team that's thinking through like, hey, what are this administration's priorities and how can we be using these authorities to go after these? That's why we've seen so much action in the fentanyl trafficking space against cartels, right? This is why we've seen a lot of activity against Iran right now. I love, quite frankly, that these networks are now in those crosshairs because someone is making a decision at a policy level, Erin, that this is a priority for the administration to use really what is our most powerful national security tools short of kinetic warfare today. So I'll stop there, but these sanctions are powerful. Now, do they have effect? Iran has been under sanctions for a really long time. Venezuela has been under sanctions for a really long time. North Korea has been under sanctions a really long time. Countries survive, countries evade sanctions. But for these individuals, being completely cut off from U.S. dollars is a pretty significant step.
It's another example of a whole nother toolbox being put to use by the U.S. government. Let me ask you this. If say Chen Zhi, I'm going to make it as easy, it has a bank account at Bank of America that has $4 million in it that's frozen from sanctions. And then what happens to that money? Such
a great question. And that's when DOJ comes in. And that's why I'm so glad we talked about civil forfeiture.
There we go.
It's interesting. I don't know if I ever really tell this story, but one of the best parts of my career, the coolest parts of my career was this amazing colleague who's now a federal judge in D.C., Zia Faruqi. He and I used to run around Washington, and we'd realized that OFAC had blocked funds. And we would say, hey, we can go ahead and file a civil forfeiture complaint against that money. Because what we're seeing is regulatory action, like we describe here, but it still takes legal action to take those funds to court and ultimately forfeit them. And we were always looking for ways to take the money because, quite frankly, in a lot of our cases, we weren't ever able to do much more than that based on the individual being in a jurisdiction that we couldn't reach, Iran and North Korea in particular. So yeah, it's exactly that. So I'd encourage any AUSAs in DC to run around trying to seize some more funds or forfeit more funds that have been blocked or seized in these types of cases.
That sounds like a fantastic opportunity. That sounds like a what if we could start grabbing what is available. And I'm sure that there is some enterprising AUSA who's already thought about this.
I think the reality is, like, when you're law enforcement, there's always pressure. You know this so well. There's always pressure to lock someone up. Like, that's what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to indict and get an arrest. And I think what we realized, and Zia was just absolute leader and always like globally on this, was that like, hey, maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe we just go take the money. And it was just incredibly powerful, especially in cases where you're never going to get your hands on it. And he really revolutionized civil forfeiture. Gave him a call after I saw this. This is unbelievable, right? But it's like, it's all the tools that I think he really kind of in part invented prosecutors using.
I love hearing that. I love hearing that because that really is the way the narrative needs to go here. And that when we are not able to get our hands on every single one of those Chinese organized crime syndicate crime bosses over there running this dirty business, what we can do is take their money, and they really don't want us to do that. So I love that the U.S. government has put some solid effort into it. Let's go to the last point that was new to me. And explain to me what all this FinCEN business means and specifically how it relates to WeWan.
It's really interesting. So in May of this year, Treasury took a 311 action and they put out a notice of proposed rulemaking that essentially they were going to make a rule that WeWan had to, as a primary money laundering concern, was going to have restrictions. And there are a number of different possible restrictions there. Ultimately, as part of this action, or at least being announced as part of this action, they finalized that rule and took sort of the most extreme measure, which is essentially cutting WeWan off from the global financial system. And why did they do that? Essentially, what FinCEN says here is that between August 2021 and January 2025, WeWan, which is a essentially financial institution that was essentially laundered over $4 billion in illicit proceeds, including about $37 million associated with North Korea, and to this case, about $36 million stemming from online romance scams, pig butchering, fraud schemes. So really, it had become a go-to money laundering.
So at the end of the day, we know that WeWan was one of the major platforms where this dirty laundering of pig butchering money was happening. And so it sounds like what FinCEN is doing is by designating and calling them out, they've really eliminated their ability to move money globally.
That's exactly right. And that's what the 311 is meant to do, essentially, is to be able to go after foreign financial institutions. For example, sanctions is essentially cutting off different entities, individuals or entities from the U.S. financial system. This is essentially designating a foreign entity as a primary money laundering concern, meaning no U.S. businesses or persons are able to engage with them, which is the ultimate penalty in this case. So all of this is to say that as part of this announcement, essentially Treasury and the broader United States government is saying, hey, we're also going to go after what we believe is a primary money laundering concern that's connected to this network or this type of network of activity. So slightly tangential, but again, like in all the same press announcements and very sort of consistent with what this is, what's going on here.
So I hate to be greedy, and I hate to say you've just served me a delicious sundae, but now I'm wondering if you have a piece of chocolate cake. What do you think about the U.S. government's ability to do this again and again with other really horrible known crime bosses in Southeast Asia?
I think that this is a playbook. I really think this is a playbook, and I think I think the public's response was probably very good to this. I think it's one of those areas that's not that controversial. We're seeing, when we would do cases, quite frankly, with sanctions or other type of activity against Iran, when I was at Treasury, oftentimes our foreign partners did not want to go along with those. That was very politically charged. Our view of Iran was different than some of our closest allies. This is not that. Every developed country in the world is facing this scourge. And, my hope is we saw the UK in here, but we should see more countries, not to give you more work. But I think you've done a pretty masterful job of getting the U.S. national security apparatus on board with this. But I do think, or mess with your travel schedule, but I do think, it's really important to get allies like Australia, Five Eyes, like European partners, like Asia, our APAC partners are going to be absolutely critical here, right? Singapore, Japan, Korea, elsewhere. And honestly, I know you've done a lot of work here too, but getting some of our not always partners involved here is going to be absolutely critical. Putting more pressure on China, getting them to realize that this is a huge problem for them as much as for anyone else, I think is really important. So I'll kind of stop there, but I think that we can see this playbook run over and over, and I'm hoping we'll have even more support from our foreign partners as we do this.
It feels like we have a lot of positive momentum here. It feels like we're getting positive response on the Hill. It feels like banks are coming to the table. It feels like a lot of people are taking this as seriously as it should be taken. I will always say that I think there's room for our social media platforms to do more, and I'll leave it at that for now. Ari, thank you so much for explaining this on a level that helped me understand a lot more about what happened here.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I love talking to you about these things, and I think this was particularly extraordinary. I think really, really interesting moment, and I'm hopeful. I think at the end, I'm hopeful that we'll continue to take these types of actions and use every tool that we have in the toolbox. So thank you, and again, just so grateful for all the work that you do, and the educational piece is the most critical. We can do all this stuff, but we've got to also stop the demand side, if you will. And I think that that's going to be absolutely critical to this. And you're such a leader there. So thank you, Erin.
Thank you. You've given me so many accolades in this podcast, but thank you very much for TRM's leadership in this space as well, and for consistently pointing out the problems and where this all leads. So thanks again for being here today, Ari.
Thank you.